What they did was a perversion of the American way. They had the best product, they had the best people selling the product.
I wanted to give them what they deserved.
I wanted to prosecute the son of a gun.
Between 1969 and 1974, the number of heroin addicts across the US rises from approximately 240,000 to over 500,000 people. No region of the country is more devastated than the New York tri-state area.
It was horrible.
The poorest neighborhoods are the hardest hit. In Harlem, the crime rate is 50% higher than New York City as a whole.
It was terrible. You go to the schoolyards and you find needles full of stuff. You would see emaciated people who obviously were addicted to drugs, staggering around, lying on the streets. You'd find needles all over the place.
The problem was very serious. You know, people were dying. The gangsters were making a ton of money, which encouraged them to bring only more in.
Dealers constantly change the name of their product to tempt in new customers.
Bags of heroin were marked with different logos. Could be anything.
Mean Machine, Coolie High, The Judge, Harlem Hijack. But recently a new brand, Blue Magic, has hit the streets, and it's the most potent mix yet.
You go down the street and pick up an empty glassine envelope that had marked Blue Magic. So we knew Blue Magic was killing people.
On both sides of the Hudson River, New York and New Jersey officials have set up independent narcotics task forces to find out where this lethal flood of heroin is coming from and who is behind it. Hard-hitting U.S. Attorney Dom Amorosa heads up the New York operation with a team of NYPD and DEA officers.
I was driven by a desire to punish narcotics violators who were making a lot of money while destroying the city. The DEA people were standing right alongside of me. Everybody was motivated by that, to do their jobs and to remove these people from the city, put them in prison.
Across the river in New Jersey, Assistant District Attorney Richie Roberts spearheads his own independent task force. He's just as hell-bent on bringing down the powerful criminal network behind Blue Magic. Born in the poverty-stricken Bronx, Roberts has seen the devastating effects of heroin firsthand.
I had someone in my own family who became addicted to heroin. I felt a need to find out who was doing this, to lock them up. I wanted it stopped. I really did.
Having served as a Marine and a New Jersey detective before becoming a DA, Roberts has the experience to do it. Since 1968, informants have been whispering the names of more than a dozen street-level drug dealers, all small fry and not worth netting.
On any investigation into heroin, the goal is to get to the top, to get to the suppliers.
But by 1970, one of those names is now a big fish. The surprise is that he's not with the mafia. He's a black 40-year-old crime boss from Harlem called Frank Lucas. Born in 1930 in LaGrange, North Carolina, Frank Lucas caught a Greyhound to New York at 17. He started out robbing bars and stores at gunpoint to make a quick buck, and was quickly taken under the wing of a racketeer and drug dealer, Bumpy Johnson.
Bumpy was a legendary gangster. When you look, the first African-American gangster that I know of in Harlem.
Bumpy Johnson was really the first black man that was able to control his own area. Bumpy controlled the gambling, narcotics, and whatever else nefarious operations were going on. It was Bumpy stuff.
I don't think there's anybody more significant that was on the scene during those times than Bumpy Johnson.
Bumpy ran a heroin operation, buying in bulk from the mafia, then selling to addicts on the street.
Bumpy was the mentor, Frank was the protege. Frank wanted to get into the business, and Bumpy sort of introduced Frank on his way.
Bumpy hires Frank to help him run his setup. But in 1968, suddenly dies from a heart attack, age 62. Seizing the moment, Lucas claims Bumpy's Harlem turf for himself, using violence on anyone who gets in his way. Looking for foot soldiers he can completely trust, Lucas brings a dozen family members up from North Carolina to serve as the muscle of his operation. Known as the Country Boys, they keep a lethal grip on Lucas's fast-growing territory.
They were a very, very violent group. Violence was not the last step, violence was the first step. They terrorized the old drug dealers and they forced them off the streets. They were brutal. They would throw them off the roof. There were people being shot. They cleaned up the old-time drug dealers through violence. And in speaking to some of the old dealers, they would say, these guys are crazy. You know, they'll kill us, we're done. And they basically replaced the old dealers on the streets here with the Country Boys, who totally controlled New Jersey and Frank's end in New York. What they did was a perversion of the American way. They had the best product, they had the best people selling the product, they had the locations where the product could be purchased, the advertising through the name, they had it all.
So Richie sends his task force of New Jersey cops and DEA special agents onto the street to chase down every potential informant and dig for any leads to where Lucas and his Country Boys cut and stash their heroin.
When heroin is brought in to the country, that heroin is cut. They used to call it being stepped on. You step on it once, put 50% lactose, it's now 50% pure. Do it again, it's 25% pure. Do it again, it's half of that. Each time it's cut, there's more money to be made by the people who are selling it. That's how they make their profit. So there has to be a place where they're cutting the heroin.
But building up trust with informants is long and dangerous work. If they get it wrong, people could wind up dead.
Undercover work is extremely dangerous, but the whole goal in undercover work is to gain information and evidence about the organization and the individuals in that organization, to know who the hierarchy is. It's a cat and mouse game, and you can't rush it. You have to take your time and build that relationship, because people that are doing things that are illegal, they know the penalties are extremely high. And so they're very cautious, especially if somebody tries to come on a little bit too strong and too quickly to be a friend.
The long hours and high risks pay off when a tip-off identifies a key lieutenant in Frank's organization, his cousin, Shorty Lucas.
Shorty was a short, stocky, black guy. Didn't look like Frank, particularly. When Shorty came around, that was somebody big, because people would, kowtow to him, come up to him. Shorty was a vicious son of a gun. He was a very big player. He controlled Jersey, and his other brothers controlled the other boroughs. But I think Shorty was the most vicious. He earned a reputation in the street as a killer, as someone who you have to watch out for, because he killed people without much thought. He was a man in criminal lingo, of respect on the street. because of his brutality. He didn't want to mess with Shorty. And word got around. And Shorty was visible, too. Shorty would drive around. I don't remember, he had a really nice car. I don't remember if it was a Cadillac or a Beamer or whatever. And his wife, who was a pretty woman, also was always with him. And they became pretty well-known. Well-known enough to get a wire on him? No. But well enough through all different areas of surveillance and intelligence to know he was the main guy in Jersey. They would take people who, of their own organization, not strangers, who they felt might be informing, or they felt were stealing money or drugs, take them to the George Washington Bridge. And I was told that they would take them and hang them over that area until they gave them the information that they were looking for. And I was told that they always did. They didn't want to be dropped down into the Hudson River.
Although the task force know that Shorty is closely connected to Lucas, they can't get enough evidence to arrest him.
It was very discouraging because we couldn't get the link with Frank. No one would talk. We couldn't get the level where we could connect the main player.
And with addicts still dying on the streets, Richie Roberts' superiors turn up the heat.
There was a lot of pressure. The sheriff believed in the old way. He wanted us to lock up dozens of users and then make a headline. The prosecutor didn't want that to happen.
Roberts knows that locking up low-level dealers makes headlines, but in the long run, doesn't pay.
So I was kind of almost like a messenger boy going between all these different people and trying to calm everybody down, to remind them, hey, they created us for a purpose. Let's not forget what our purpose is, and let's get Frank Lucas.
Meanwhile, across the river in New York, Assistant U.S. Attorney Dom Amorosa and his team get a lucky break. For the past 2 years, he's been running a separate investigation into the mafia's heroin operations in New York.
The mafia was involved heavily in the importation of narcotics.
The mafia is involved in crime and making profits. So whether it's numbers, whether it's prostitution, whether it's gambling, whatever's going to yield a lot of money, the mafia tries to figure out a way how to muscle in and take advantage of that. And during the 70s, it was heroin distribution.
I wanted to remove these narcotics offenders from the streets, give them what they deserved.
During Amorosa's investigation into the mafia, just as in New Jersey, one name comes up again and again: Frank Lucas.
Lucas was identified through informant information as a major distributor of heroin in the New York City metropolitan area. People, on the street who would go to a DEA agent and say, I'm hearing that, Lucas is the guy, this is a Lucas deal.
But since the New York and New Jersey teams aren't working together, Richie Roberts doesn't have this new critical piece of the puzzle.
I was aware through the U.S. Attorney's Office that there was a concurrent investigation going on to Frank Lucas. I didn't want to know what their investigation was going on, and I'm sure felt the same way about mine. It's an ego thing. They want to be the first to get Lucas. I want to be the first to get Lucas.
With so many lives at stake, Roberts and Amorosa want to catch Lucas as fast as possible. And with street dealers refusing to talk, they take their investigations in a new direction and go in search of the people supplying Lucas with his deadly heroin. By 1972, the heroin epidemic hitting New York and New Jersey is worse than ever. The need to find the suppliers of this deadly drug becomes more urgent every day. As heroin floods the streets, the two task forces desperately try to find the man they believe is behind the epidemic, Kingpin Frank Lucas. But so far, they don't have any hard evidence connecting him or his gang, the Country Boys, to this drug destroying entire neighborhoods.
It's my town, and it was wasting away.
In New Jersey, Assistant Prosecutor Richie Roberts has identified Frank Lucas's cousin Shorty, who informants say is a key member of Frank's organization, cutting and selling his heroin. But the task force can't get close to Lucas's outfit to prove the link.
I wanted to lock up Frank Lucas, and I wanted to prosecute the son of a gun.
Then Assistant Prosecutor Richie Roberts has an idea. If he can track where the heroin is coming from, maybe it can be linked to Lucas. The chemical structure of a poppy plant depends on where it's grown in the world.
Traditionally, the heroin in the United States had come through the French Connection, which was Turkish opium converted into heroin by Corsican laboratory operators and then smuggled into the U.S. by the Italian mafia.
But when the lab tests the heroin which Lucas and his country boys are peddling, they get a big surprise.
We discovered that it came from Asia, which was new, and it was pure. Who's bringing it in? That was what everybody wanted to know.
Throughout the Vietnam War, increasing amounts of heroin are being smuggled into the US from an area known as the Golden Triangle in Laos, Burma, and Thailand. Intelligence officer and Bronze Star recipient Charles Lutz is investigating the emerging Asian connection. Now, with the DEA, he wants to work out how Golden Triangle heroin is making its way into the US.
The Vietnam War most definitely contributed to the heroin epidemic in the United States. We had soldiers who were exposed to heroin in Vietnam. And so unfortunately, a lot of them used it and took their habit back to the United States. We were arresting more and more people and finding that the heroin that they were found in possession of originated in Southeast Asia.
Back in New Jersey, the task force are still stuck with a big question.
We knew it was from Asia. We knew it had to get in the country some way, but we didn't know how.
While Roberts and his team in New Jersey puzzle over Lucas's Asian connection, across the Hudson River in New York, a task force working with Assistant U.S. Attorney Dom Amorosa are convinced that Lucas is still buying some of his heroin from the mafia. A key player in Amorosa's team is DEA agent Greg Korniloff.
With a specific mission targeting a group of Italian heroin traffickers in New York City.
They set their sights on a known mafia associate and heroin dealer.
Our main target was Anthony Verzino, who had connections with organized crime elements within New York City. Verzino wasn't a made man. Verzino was a worker. He'd respond to any requests organized crime made to enhance their criminal activity. Maybe burglary or maybe crack a head here and there, collect some money.
Verzino first came to the DEA's attention by accident after an incident with a DEA informant in a New York State prison.
Anthony Verzino was doing time there for narcotics. During a race riot, he and another inmate, a huge Irishman, were cornered by a gang of black inmates who were threatening to kill him. The other inmate picks up a mop bucket, starts swinging it over his head. After he knocks a couple heads, the black gang decides to depart. The other inmate's name was Jimmy Culhane. Verzino was, of course, very appreciative. Culhane saved his life. They developed a friendship during their term in prison.
Culhane continues as an informant for the DEA. When he's released from jail 3 years later, he begins buying heroin from Verzino, who already has a long-established dealing operation outside the mafia.
He contacts Verzino because of the friendship and the trust they've established. Vizino agrees to front him half a kilo of heroin.
But Vizino doesn't know that Culhane is an informant for the DEA.
That allowed us to obtain intelligence regarding Vizino's operations.
The DEA monitor every meeting they have.
Every controlled purchase we made from Vizino was covered by surveillance agents and officers. Culhane was always wired. He always wore a body recorder or a shortwave radio to document the conversations he was having with Vizino.
In one of Culhane's recorded meetings with Vizino, the Italian mentions an all-too-familiar name, Frank Lucas. It's a big break for the New York team, and intelligence that the New Jersey task force doesn't have. Vizino refers to Lucas as a major buyer of heroin and an extremely bad payer. The Italian drug dealer has had enough.
During that meeting, Vizino asked Culhane to take a contract out on Lucas. Apparently, Lucas owed Vizino over $300,000 for prior drug sales, and he wasn't anteing up. So he wanted Culhane to kill Lucas.
This proof that Lucas is buying heroin in large quantities is what the DEA in New York suspected. But to move in, they need more than hearsay. They need hard evidence. The chance comes in another recorded meeting in which Vizino gives up to Culhane where he's hiding his own heroin.
Vizino told Culhane, and this is how much he trusted him, that he was proceeding from that restaurant in the Bronx to his plant, where he was stashing his narcotics and other contraband. We followed Vizino from there directly to that apartment building, so we pretty well had it pegged as to where the stash was. Vizino thought when he saw us coming at him, he was going to get whacked by another crew.
Vizino's ordered to let them into his apartment. Inside is a gold mine of incriminating evidence.
We searched the apartment and located the cash. We seized about 26 pounds of heroin. In addition to the drugs and other contraband, a large volume of ledgers.
And carefully written inside one of the ledgers is the name of their prime target.
And that was the infamous Frank Lucas.
But to get a conviction against Lucas, the DEA need Vizino to make a statement, explicitly linking him to the heroin sales listed in the ledgers. They give Vizino a choice: information or prison. Vizino takes an age to weigh up his options. He knows that if he clams up, it could be the rest of his life behind bars. But if he squeals, Lucas might find out, and then he'd be as good as dead. Vizino decides to talk, tying Harlem kingpin Frank Lucas to a string of major heroin deals.
Vizino identified Lucas as one of his customers. He gave us specific dates, specific amounts of drugs he supplied Lucas, and specific amounts of money he received from Lucas.
It's a huge break for the New York police and DEA, and they immediately order Lucas's arrest. The task force race to Lucas's home in Teaneck, New Jersey.
When you're going to arrest somebody, you're nervous.
The team has no idea if Lucas has his country boys guarding him. If he does, they're likely to be armed to the teeth.
It's high anxiety because you can't control the outcome.
We're all apprehensive. You always are before an arrest. You really don't know what's going to happen, especially when a defendant is inside a location. You don't know how many people are in there, whether he has any weapons. So it gets your blood pressure up a little, but you rely on your professional training. You rely on the other officers with you, their professionalism. You rely on each other that you're going to get the job done.
The sirens are silenced as they approach Lucas's home.
We approached the residence as quietly as possible. We didn't want to alert Lucas or anybody else in the premises.
You just hope that everything's going to go right.
Go.
We surrounded the residence to ensure that nobody escaped either out of the side of the residence or in the back.
As Korniloff knocks on the door, he knows this could end instantly in a massive shootout. The next moment will change everything.
Frank opens the door.
Frank Lucas stands alone, unarmed and completely caught off guard.
I told him who I was. We had an arrest warrant for him. You're under arrest for narcotics trafficking.
After months of hard work, the Harlem crime boss is finally in custody. But the drug money he's stashed inside the house isn't.
While I was advising him of his rights, Lucas's wife and maid were throwing bags full of cash out a rear window.
The bag stuffed with money gives the task force probable cause to search the house for more evidence.
Closets, drawers, cabinets, opening doors, under the bed. Looking for hidden cash sites.
Then finally, they hit the mother lode.
We found more than $500,000 in cash in several suitcases. The cash actually was street money, 50s, 20s, something a street dealer would accept payment and sell his drugs for. It was counted in front of witnesses. Actually, it was counted twice to make sure they had a true count. Frank saw the money being counted. Naturally, he was very unhappy that we'd found the money and what was developing for his future. Then it was sealed in suitcases and transported back to our office under guard and submitted into evidence.
Lucas is refused bail and sent straight to jail in New York, pending trial. Assistant U.S. Attorney Dom Amorosa immediately starts preparing a case with the New York Attorney's Office to try Lucas for buying and dealing vast quantities of heroin. He'll have to prove that Vazino's ledger is more than just circumstantial evidence, and that the $500,000 found in Lucas's house is without doubt the profits from heroin sales. Otherwise, the kingpin could walk free. Richie Roberts is relieved to hear that Lucas is in custody in New York, but he's determined to make sure Lucas also stands trial in New Jersey. However, the only evidence he has is circumstantial, that the heroin his cousin Shorty's dealing comes from Southeast Asia.
I felt great, but now I started worrying. Do I have enough to get Lucas? Can I do it? I got called down to the prosecutor's office, Joe Lord. He said, Richie, if you lose, it's a problem for you the rest of your life. But I'm going to say this to you. It's your call. It's your investigation. If you decide you want to go, we will back you. I will back you to the end. Don't worry about that. Your call.
Roberts knows there's only one choice. He reboots his investigation by taking a longer look at Lucas's extended family. It turns out one of Lucas's cousins, Ike Atkinson, has been running a bar in Thailand with business partner Herman Jackson.
Jackson ended up in Bangkok, and what he found there, he liked. It was a wide open city. Prostitution was legal, or at least it was ignored by law enforcement authorities. They had live sex shows, they had drugs, they had you name it.
DEA agents working in Thailand have long suspected Atkinson's bar was a front for trafficking heroin.
As I understand it, Jackson had read about the heroin epidemic in the United States and thought this would be a great opportunity because His girlfriend, her uncle, was apparently a big-time heroin dealer and had access to unlimited quantities of heroin. So Jack and Ike decided that they were going to get into the heroin business.
Herman Jackson and Ike Atkinson are caught smuggling drugs into the US and sent to jail. But even with these two behind bars, the DEA still have no direct proof tying Frank Lucas to their Thai operation. So Roberts is forced to send his surveillance team back onto the mean streets of New Jersey to see if they can get any new dirt on the country boys. Even with Lucas in jail pending trial, his heroin business continues to boom.
Blue magic was still flooding the area. The people were still lying on the streets.
Their target, to nail at least one of Lucas's country boys and get him to rat on his boss. The team know it's going to be difficult and extremely dangerous. The country boys are quick to kill anyone they suspect to be a threat to their organization. Finally, after months of surveillance, they get the break they've been waiting for.
We got word that a large shipment of heroin was coming up. People were telling us, the city's dry, we can't get any stuff. And then everybody's getting excited. Something's coming in. We're gonna have a party this weekend. So we knew something was happening.
They set up positions round the neighborhood, tracking small-time dealers and addicts, and notice a steady coming and going from one building.
And we saw characters that we knew.
The task force enter the block. There's every chance they might be spotted by the country boys and shot at. But the task force need to identify the apartment they think is being used as the center for drug dealing.
They're guarded. You gotta really know what you're doing to be able to identify an apartment.
After several days of surveillance, the team thinks they've found the place and stake it out. Days go by and nothing. Then a huge tip comes in.
We got tremendous intelligence about Shorty Lucas.
They know Shorty is a key member of his cousin's empire, but Roberts has never had cold, hard proof. Now, he finally might.
We knew Shorty was delivering this stuff. We were pretty darn sure that this was the delivery.
Richie Roberts gives his takedown team the go-ahead. Carefully they move in, knowing there's a chance some of them might not come back alive.
Shorty had a reputation of killing people.
The task force move in on the apartment, not knowing what lies on the other side of the door.
Everybody threw up their hands immediately. They have guns pointed at people's heads. No one's gonna do anything. We found a lot of kilos of heroin, a lot of cut, all paraphernalia used to bag in the glassine envelopes. Tons of stuff all over the place.
The bust is everything Assistant District Attorney Richie Roberts wanted. Drugs, money, and country boys, all rolled into one.
I could not have felt better. I felt terrific. It was probably the first time in my lifetime that I actually saw something concrete that we did in narcotic enforcement. I was really proud of it. So were my guys, and I was proud of them. And they felt the same way. Everybody did.
Richie Roberts finally has the country boys in custody.
They were indicted by the grand jury, and we rounded everybody up and locked them all up. I think we got just about everybody. The entire country boy operation, including his brothers who ran the New York aspect of it.
With heroin kingpin Frank Lucas awaiting trial, Roberts hopes to put the final nail in his coffin.
We took each guy individually and tried to get them to cooperate, threatening them, you know.
He figures if he pushes hard enough, one of the country boys will rat on their boss.
Back in those days, there was a statute in New Jersey. If you're caught with drugs, it's 0 to 30 years. So you could have a dime bag or you could have 25 keys. You still can get 30 years. So, you know, it's very simple.
Richie Roberts makes it as clear as he can.
Listen, pal, you're going away for the rest of your life. You're going to wait for 30 years. You want to cut it down? Help us.
But Lucas's country boys, most of them family members, refuse to talk.
No one wanted to say a word.
Then Richie Roberts pulls in Lucas's 17-year-old nephew.
I sat down with the nephew and said to him basically, look, you can go away for 30 years. Your life is over. You're a young guy. You can help yourself. We will protect you. Oh, no one's going to protect me. We will protect you. You will make certain that no one knows anything about you until you testify. You have to testify. You have to get up on the stand and testify.
Richie Roberts offers the kid a reduced sentence and anonymity in return for information on Lucas.
He finally agreed to testify and to give information. And wow, did he give information. Not just about Frank, but about Shorty, about the other brothers who controlled the other boroughs in the city, about everything. He told us everything that he knew about the operation. The details that he had were amazing. He had a photographic memory. He remembered dates and places that we went back and checked, and sure enough, he was right on everything.
Finally, the silence around Lucas has been broken, and Roberts has damning first-hand evidence from an accomplice.
This is when I found out there was a contract out on me. I got called into Mr. Lordi's office, and there were 2 FBI guys in the office with him. And Joe told me, look, we have information that there's a contract out on you, and you know, we want you to be careful. We want to assign these 2 FBI agents to protect you. The FBI doesn't have a good reputation among locals. Certainly, they've changed, thank God. But back then, first of all, they never shared information. Second of all, I'm in Newark. I got these 2 blue-eyed, blonde-haired guys with fedora hats on their head. They're going to protect me. They will create more attention towards me than anything else. So I said, I appreciate the offer, boss, but no, I think I can handle myself. I prefer, you know, to be alone. I don't want anybody following me 24/7. So he said, well, would you do me a favor and would you at least wear a weapon? I said, well, sure, I could do that. So, and I knew how to fire a weapon. I was in the Marines. I was a detective. But where am I going to put it? So I decided to have an ankle holster where it wouldn't be a bulge and wouldn't be something on my side. So I put it on an ankle holster. I mean, we actually caught the guy who had the contract. I was a little insulted. It was only $50,000, but those days it was a lot of money.
With the nephew's testimony, Roberts feels confident that, like Amorosa in New York, he too can put Frank Lucas on the stand in a separate trial in a New Jersey court.
I remember this like it was like yesterday. He came in like the President of the United States. He sat down, turned around and looked at me. And I turned around and looked at him. And I'm thinking, he's thinking, look at this little piece of dirt who's trying to get me convicted. And I'm thinking, yeah, it's me and I'm going to convict you. Finally got the SOB in court, ready to go to trial.
Roberts puts his case to the jury, citing the damning testimony of the nephew and the bag stuffed with $500,000 in small bills found at Lucas's home.
You have to create something where you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt, in this case, that Frank Lucas was the mastermind of all of this stuff that we're going to bring in.
But as the trial unfolds, Richie Roberts senses his evidence isn't having the impact on the jury that he'd hoped for. Worried he might lose the case, he makes one last wild throw of the dice and calls a witness no one expects.
I brought in a woman who lost her daughter as a result of an overdose of blue magic. She was magnificent. She's from the ghetto, from the projects, but very, very articulate. And she told a story how her daughter was in the bathroom. She didn't respond. She knocked at the door. She finally opens the door and found her daughter literally lying on the floor with the needle still in her vein and a packet of blue magic. When she finished testifying, there wasn't a sound in the courtroom. People were crying, literally crying. The judge asks any cross-examination. No one would dare ask this woman a question. No question, no question, no question, no question. That was real life, that was emotional, that was true tragedy. And it's blue magic that she saw. And blue magic got traced all the way up the line to Frank Lucas.
Her powerful testimony even has an effect on Lucas.
After she testified, his lawyer said that Frank wanted to talk to me. I said, "What do you want to talk to me for?" He said, "He wants to talk to you alone without me." I said, "Okay," and in my mind, I'm thinking, well, maybe after hearing that, he's gonna want to plead guilty and go from there. They have a very small holding cell in the Essex County Court. He said to me, "I never thought about it that way," something like that. I mean, that's how emotional it was. I never thought about it that way. And I said, well, that's the way it was. That's the way it is. You're telling me this because you want to plead guilty, you want to end this? He said, no. He says, I don't know what's going to happen, but if I'm found guilty, I'll get a hold of you. There's no doubt in my mind that Frank knew he was going to turn as soon as he was convicted.
If Lucas talks, it could mean getting the names of his mafia contacts and high-level indictments that would transform New York's criminal landscape. But that will only happen if Lucas is convicted. After nearly a week considering the evidence, the jury comes to a unanimous decision.
I was scared to death. I didn't know if it would work.
As he waits for the jury's verdict, the words of Roberts' boss ring in his ears.
I kept on thinking, if you lose Frank Lucas, you're going to be known as the guy who lost to Frank Lucas for the rest of your life.
"5 years of Roberts' life are invested in this case, and his future career hangs on the jury's decision.
Guilty, Your Honor.
Frank Lucas is sentenced to 30 years.
Oh my God. I can't even describe it. It's just like the weight of the world came off my shoulders. Just pure happiness. When I looked at Frank, I looked at him right away. He looked at Larry Dubin, his attorney, and I didn't see anger, you know? I thought I would, but he looked hurt, like, how could you do this to me? You know, sitting back today, I don't know how I got the verdict. I really don't. Except that there was, I'm telling you, that lovely lady's testimony, that poor soul who lost her daughter, was so compelling. I've never seen anything like it since. I really believe that was what got Frank Lucas convicted.
Frank Lucas is behind bars, but Richie Roberts' job isn't over just yet. He wants to know the names of everyone in Lucas's drug empire. So he waits for the call from Lucas, the one he promised to make if he was convicted. But 2 days pass without word. Roberts starts to worry that Lucas has changed his mind. Then he gets the all-important call.
he said he wants to talk to me. I said, I want to know everybody you ever sold a dime bag to. I want to know everybody you ever took $1 from the time you started until the time you stopped. If you lie, you're done. If you tell the truth, you got a good shot of seeing the light of day. He had no qualms. He had no qualms. He had his mind made up. He told us everything from day one.
Roberts asks the most burning question. Who were Lucas's contacts in the mafia?
Frank told us about New York wise guys. He gave me all kinds of names of people. All of them were from New York.
Unable to prosecute Lucas's associates in New Jersey, Roberts hands his evidence to attorneys in New York. Meanwhile, Dom Amorosa also puts Lucas on the stand in his own federal trial.
It was the most important case that I ever tried. Probably the biggest case up until that time that the United States Attorney's Office prosecuted.
The case is a slam dunk, and Lucas is found guilty. He's sentenced to an additional 40 years, and all of his assets worth $37 million are seized. They include an office building in Detroit, apartments in Los Angeles, Miami, Puerto Rico, and Harlem, and bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. Now facing 70 years in jail, Lucas again decided to cooperate with U.S. attorneys.
He had a motivation to lessen the sentence, as many of these people do. He identified as large narcotics distributors, so he had a wealth of information that he provided.
Lucas's assistance with attorneys helped convict 25 additional narcotics violators. It brought one of the darkest chapters in the fight against heroin to a close.
To think that I've done something in my lifetime that has probably saved lives, people's lives, strangers who I don't even know. And I'm thanked by the relatives of some of these strangers, and it's just a great feeling to know that I could do that.
It's the story that demands to be told. The rise from small-time crook to New York drug baron.
Frank Lucas was an incredible street-dealing boss.
The first Harlem gangster to turn the tables on the mafia.
Frank cut out the mafia so he could deliver direct.
Creating a drug network responsible for a countrywide epidemic.
You can't overstate how bad the problem was.
Frank Lucas's rise and fall inspires the hit movie American Gangster. But Hollywood got the wrong guy. The real American Gangster was an ex-army sergeant in control of a vast heroin network. This drug lord is untouchable until Frank Lucas exacts revenge.
He who has the dope rules.
This is the real story of American Gangster. (1973), Newark, New Jersey, is gripped by a major heroin epidemic. The vast housing projects are rife with drug addicts overdosing. Law enforcement is desperate to find a solution. Richie Roberts is the head of a special narcotics task force in New Jersey. He's the key prosecutor depicted in the movie American Gangster.
Newark, Camden, Trenton, wherever there was a inner city and a minority population, you could see addicts lying on the street corners, sleeping in their cars. You could find needles on the streets. You could find needles in playgrounds. It's hard for me to believe my own mind pictures because it was that bad.
Officers from Richie's New Jersey Special Narcotics Unit are responding to a report of 2 dead bodies in a Newark housing project. They first find the body of a young boy.
Kids of heroin addicts, if God forbid both the mother and father are addicts, they're on their own from day one. Have we discovered kids ingesting heroin back in those days? Yeah. I mean, I don't think anybody purposely gave it to them, but it's laying around these houses all the time.
When they find the boys' parents, both are dead from overdoses of heroin.
You can't overstate how bad the problem was. You really can't. It was horrible. It was just horrible. Heroin, in particular, was out of control.
Behind this new epidemic is a previously unknown brand of heroin.
The glassine envelopes are marked with the brand, Blue Magic.
But nobody knows where Blue Magic is coming from or who is behind it. Across the Hudson River, Blue Magic also has New York City in its grip.
Early 1970s, it was estimated, probably a low estimation, that there were about 500,000 heroin addicts in the United States, 200,000 of them in New York alone.
Well, it was a massive problem. It was very difficult to deal with the traffickers in an effective and efficient manner because there were so many of them. So much heroin was being imported into the city. Many people got involved because the monies to be earned by this criminal element were enormous, and it was a very difficult problem.
The Federal Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, formed in 1973 to combat drug crime around the country. Their primary focus in New York City is the mafia.
When you look at the mafia, the 5 families of the mafia, the Bonanos, the Colombos, Gambinos, Genoveses, and Lucchese's, they were headquartered in New York City with distribution tentacles and captains and bosses around the country.
Historically, the mafia controlled 80% of the heroin trade. It came into the US from Turkey via the infamous French connection. The mafia refined the heroin in Marseille, France, before shipping it to New York City. Often smuggled in the hollow spaces of cars. But when the US government financed the destruction of Turkish poppy fields, they thought they had cut the heroin supply off forever. But out of nowhere, Blue Magic floods the market. Purer, cheaper, and more addictive.
I can't remember how many people a week or a month were dying from overdoses and other causes, but it was terrible.
New York as a whole was always the major point where the drugs would come in before they'd even be filtered off to Detroit or Chicago. But Harlem by the 1970s was really the epicenter of drug distribution, particularly heroin.
Users are all ages and from all walks of life. The effects of heroin are indiscriminate.
I had a family member, a dear cousin. He got on stuff. He said, I gotta get out. I'm gonna kill myself.
Finding the source of Blue Magic is the cops' urgent priority.
We were told, stop this epidemic. Our main focus was to find out where the heroin was coming from, how it got up into the Jersey area, and to stop it.
December 1973, New York. The DEA decides to start at the bottom of the chain and work up. They arrest 2 known distributors, Mario Perna and Tony Vazino. The cops hope these mafia distributors will lead them to the man behind the heroin.
When Perna and Vazino were arrested, they were in possession of an enormous quantity of heroin, which was earmarked for Frank Lucas.
Frank Lucas was already on the police radar. Could the Harlem heroin dealer be the man behind Blue Magic?
We knew about him going back to at least 1970 or thereabouts, but could not make a case on him.
A subsequent raid on Vazino's apartment provides the cops with hard evidence linking the mafia to Frank.
He had paperwork on him, his, quote, books, which named Lucas and the wholesalers by code name and their real telephone numbers.
Under questioning, Perna and Vizino name Frank. It's the final piece of evidence the cops need. It's obvious the authorities are dealing with a major player. But who is Frank Lucas? The story starts in Harlem 8 years earlier. Back then, Frank Lucas was a low-level drug pusher from North Carolina who had been dealing heroin in Harlem for 5 years.
Frank Lucas obviously had some street sense to come from the South and set up shop in the epicenter of narcotics dealing in New York City. He had something.
Frank was getting his heroin from the mafia. Progressing from a small-scale thief, Frank is impressed by the amount of money heroin brings in. If he can move up the food chain, he can make even more. But he needs to make a name for himself.
Frank Lucas, like any other rising drug lord, in order to become that, you have to attain some kind of reputation on the street.
Frank lends a street thug named Tango a kilo of heroin to make a deal. But when Frank wants his money, Tango doesn't pay up. Frank takes the opportunity he's been waiting for. Tango's death pushes Frank up the ladder.
Frank was quite comfortable in telling the story of how he killed someone, which will certainly give you street credibility.
It's the kind of ruthlessness that draws the attention of Harlem's big fish. And it isn't long before he gets his chance to move up the chain. Harlem, New York, 1966. Frank is hustling pool in a club on 7th Avenue. Also hustling that night is Ice Pick Red, a local thug known for being a ruthless contract killer.
Ice Pick said, I want to play you for $1,000.
It's a dangerous challenge. Frank tries to lower the risk, but Ice Pick refuses. He isn't a man to cross. Suddenly, the stakes are unexpectedly raised.
In walks Bumpy Johnson, right? Dressed to the nines, the legend.
Bumpy Johnson has made his bones with one of the most powerful families in organized crime.
Bumpy rose up through and became an associate, a friend of the Genovese crime family. So by the 1950s, early 60s, Bumpy Johnson was a legend, not just in Harlem, but in greater New York.
It was essentially a contact with the Italian mafia. And he sort of handled a lot of their affairs within the Harlem community.
Harlem's most powerful heroin dealer heard about Frank's slaying of Tango. Now he wants to test him against a real thug.
He says, can you beat him? To Frank, can you beat this guy? And Frank says, yes, I can. So he backs him, and then dramatically, Frank Lucas runs the table, right? And wins the money.
Frank proves himself to the most powerful man in Harlem. And it pays immediate dividends.
Bumpy Johnson takes him under his wing, supposedly shows him, how to be a real gangster.
It's a significant step in Frank's career as a heroin dealer. And it isn't long before the heroin business undergoes a revolution. Harlem, New York, 1970. 4 years after Harlem drug dealer Frank Lucas became Bumpy Johnson's confidant, the heroin kingpin dies at the age of 62. Ex-thief turned heroin dealer, Frank Lucas is now the most powerful man in Harlem and seamlessly takes over Bumpy's position in the mafia supply chain.
Frank worked with Ralph Titino, who was a boss in the Lucchese crime family.
Since his introduction to high-ranking mafia boss Ralph Titino, Frank's profits are booming. And he demands increasing amounts of heroin.
Frank would get heroin from 3 to 50 kilos a weekly basis all the time during the late 60s and 70s.
Heroin demand is on the up and up in Harlem. 15,000 drug addicts live in the area, with addiction rates 12 times the national average. But after the DEA's destruction of the French Connection, the mafia's ready supply of heroin dries up. As supply reduces, prices rise, and Frank's profits are squeezed. Before long, Frank finds himself in serious debt to the mafia.
Every drug lord began to resent the mafia. The mafia charged quite a fee to import. They were the king of the importation of narcotics. Frank Lucas had tallied up some considerable debts to the mafia. Every drug dealer on the rise tends to tally up some debts, but Lucas's was, according to some stories, becoming dangerous levels.
The DEA were monitoring on the wire some Italian gangsters, right? Italian American gangsters. And they were talking about killing Frank because he owed over $300,000 to them.
The mafia are bad news for Frank. He is desperate to pay off his debts and find a new, reliable source to feed his customers.
I think that beginning in the early 70s, and Frank wasn't unusual in this, I think a lot of dealers were looking for new supplies of drugs.
And with the arrival of Blue Magic, it's clear that they found it. And Frank is making more money than ever. January 1973. Frank's cutting operation is in full swing. And Frank does everything he can to maximize his profits.
Frank would bring people in to cut the heroin. Very professional operation.
And Frank did everything he could to ensure that his customers wouldn't be tempted by other brands.
They wanted to corner the market. And the way they did it was to put a greater percentage of heroin in the package. In Jersey, it could be as low as 1% heroin, 3% heroin.
Frank's product is nearer to 10%.
When an addict gets a product that gives him a better and longer high, they're going to gravitate to that product.
Branding has also been key to Frank's success.
Blue Magic was Frank's brand. It was a brand name he gave his heroin. The addicts would ask for, is this Blue Magic?
Even heavily cut Blue Magic offers a greater high than the competition and is making Frank a very wealthy man.
Lucas was bringing out at least $1 million in cash a week. $1 million a week in profit.
But Blue Magic is proving deadly.
The serious problem was if they put 10% in, which they did originally, even 6-7% heroin, people are not used to that. And they started ODing. And that's what actually caused everybody to be excited about it, was that the drug populace were ODing on this brand new product called Blue Magic, which had a greater percentage of heroin, and people couldn't handle it, but everybody wanted it because it gave them a better high.
August 1973. It's clear that Frank's operation is bigger than the cops had thought. Blue magic spreads beyond New York and into New Jersey. Distribution is being handled by Frank's family, including his 17-year-old nephew and his brother, Shorty Lucas. They call themselves the Country Boys. Shorty quickly develops a reputation as a brutal enforcer.
Shorty was brutal. I mean, he was as brutal or more brutal than Frank.
The new street gang's violent reputation, encouraged by Frank and Shorty, spreads fear across New Jersey.
When they had a dealer who was short packaging them or whatever reason, they would kill him. We found bodies at the base of the projects. They were thrown off the roof.
Shorty takes control of the streets by killing off rival dealers and replacing them with his own soldiers.
They had different locations all over the place where they cut the heroin and packaged them in the glassine envelopes and sold them on the streets. Noticed that the old dealers on the streets were being tossed off, and guys were coming on, and women on occasion, with Southern accents. So it wasn't too hard to figure out who they were.
Harlem, New York, 1973. Blue magic has turned Frank's fortunes around, and he now has an estimated $50 million hidden in Cayman Island bank accounts. He likes splashing out at one of Harlem's coolest night spots, Small's Paradise.
He was notorious in terms of his expenditures, like, to show people how wealthy he was. And that, of course, attracted the attention of DEA and the government.
It's the point at which Richie Roberts enters the story.
I had a friend of mine in DEA in New York, and he took me there one night. And that was the first time I saw Frank. Everybody knew him. People were coming over, shake his hands. I mean, you really want to keep a low profile. That's not the way to play. But, good-looking guy, beautiful women around him, good-looking guys around him. He thought of himself as a businessman. He wanted to make money. And he thought of himself as a black man making inroads into a white business. And he was proud of that. He was very charismatic. He was illiterate. He's still illiterate. He knows how to count money very well.
But Roberts isn't fooled by Frank's charm.
Frank was not an urbane individual. Frank did not wear Armani suits. He didn't spout philosophy, killed people. He was a stone killer. Everybody was afraid of him. That's how he made his money. That's how he spread his poison about, because he was Frank Lucas. Mess with me and you're dead.
But though he likes to play the glamorous playboy, everyone knows what he is capable of.
Frank was not cultivated or cultured or extremely intelligent. He was a brute. He was a menace on the street. Very difficult person. Many people were afraid of him.
Richie Roberts has seen with his own eyes that Frank is making a lot of money, but he still has no idea where Blue magic is coming from. The hunt is on. 1974, Newark, New Jersey. Heroin overdoses are rising across the city. Richie Roberts pulls together a group of investigators known as the Z Team to step up the war against Frank Lucas.
We wanted to know where they were cutting the stuff. We wanted to know how it was coming up. We wanted to know how Frank was able to control this. We did everything possible to determine that.
Roberts sends a sample of Blue magic for analysis.
Through the chemist, we discovered the difference in the quality of the heroin, that it was going way up. They also can tell you what part of the world it was coming from.
The results surprised them.
It's coming from Asia. So we had a heads up immediately as to where poppies were being grown. We didn't know how it came into our country.
The only person who knows the answer is Frank. And Roberts is determined to find out. In New York, the DEA and the NYPD are also onto Frank Lucas. But everyone is keeping their cards close to their chests.
At the time I was involved, I knew very little of what New York was doing. I knew they were investigating, but I was under instructions just to, keep whatever we're doing to ourselves. I assume they were as well. Because don't forget, there was a lot of corruption, police corruption in those days. And I know they didn't trust us, and I didn't trust them. No one was telling me what investigations they were doing or how close they were to indictments, and nor was I talking to them.
In the end, it's not Richie Roberts, but the New York authorities who get to Frank Lucas first. January the 18th, 1975. Frank Lucas is at home with his wife, Julie.
Frank Lucas, we have a warrant. Tell the rest to search the truck.
When we executed that search warrant at Lucas's house, we were hoping to find currency, which would tie Lucas to a major heroin ring.
The raid delivers more than they could ever have hoped.
The DEA found at his house an enormous amount of cash, 20s and 10s, all street money. Lucas's wife tried to hide a couple of $100,000 by throwing it out the window in the presence of the DEA agents. That was very important proof.
In total, nearly $585,000 in cash is seized.
I remember at the trial, when we had to prove it, we had to bring in like 7 or 8 suitcases.
Frank Lucas and his wife are both charged. Julie for obstruction of justice. And Frank for conspiracy to distribute heroin. 1976. With Frank Lucas now serving a 40-year jail term, the police hope that the flow of cheap and potent blue magic will dry up. But the heroin is still on the streets. Whoever is distributing blue magic, it isn't Frank. Richie Roberts' New Jersey team are no closer to knowing where it is coming from. Then they get a tip-off.
We had information that a package was coming up from North Carolina. It was coming to one of the projects and one of the apartments in Newark. We had let packages come before because we wanted the big picture. We wanted to see if we could trace where it was coming. I thought to myself, and there was argument, let it go. Let's try to follow the people who, are selling it. I said, wow, if we let this stuff out on the street, there's going to be a lot of dead people out on the street. And there's going to be a lot of people exposed to it who never were exposed to it. I said, take it down. Take the package down.
Busting through the door, Richie Roberts' Z team find Frank's family street gang still alive and kicking. This takedown nets $10 million worth of heroin. And when the cops arrest the country boys, one of them is Frank's 17-year-old nephew.
That amount of drugs, back in the 70s, a New Jersey judge was going to give him life.
Facing life in jail, the kid begins to talk.
He just remembered everything, gave details, was specific, what to do with the drugs, where to take them, where to concentrate. We got the Jersey end of it from the dime bag dealer on the street to Shorty, who controlled Jersey, and above him, Frank.
The nephew's information lands Frank with another 30 years in jail. A grand total of 70 years with little hope of freedom. So Frank Lucas flips. Exposing a network of corrupt cops. And then leaving jail as a free man. This is how the movie American Gangster tells it. But the real story is very different. What the cops really want to know is, where's the blue magic coming from? Who is the real man behind the tsunami of suffering that the supercharged drug has caused?
It wasn't just, Newark, New Jersey. It was New York. It was wherever they could sell it. I've heard from DEA agents during this time that they found blue magic in California.
Desperate for freedom, Frank tells them what they want to know.
Frank testified on the record that he went to Bangkok, Thailand, for the purposes of connecting with a major heroin source there and basically cut out the mafia so he could deliver direct from Thailand into the United States of America.
The more Frank talks, the more incredible the story becomes. The route the heroin takes into the US is simply astonishing. 1972. The story starts here, 3 years before Frank's arrest. At this time, he is deep in debt to the mafia and holed up in a secret hideaway. But he is unexpectedly thrown a lifeline. He meets a heroin importer who offers him the deal of his life. Frank could make a fortune and cut the mafia out.
Frank Lucas likely met him through a mutual friend or a family member. They were both from the South. Nobody on earth seemed to know who he was and liked it that way.
The man claims to run a vast heroin smuggling operation from Southeast Asia, worth $50 million a year.
Frank, of course, was eager to get access to this supply, which eventually became Blue Magic. It gave him freedom from the Italian-American mafia. He didn't have to work with them. It was such a high quality that he can make more money.
He agrees to supply Frank, but before he leaves, Frank has a favor to ask. He needs money to pay back the mafia. Sensing Frank could be useful, he takes a chance.
He ended up loaning $25,000 to Frank Lucas to pay that debt off. At this point, he was like one of the major drug dealers in the world. He was making all kinds of money, so he could afford it.
Frank reveals the real mastermind behind Blue Magic. A dealer the cops already have in custody, Leslie Ike Atkinson. Within 2 years, Frank Lucas has become extremely wealthy, but he wants promotion. When Ike Atkinson's second-in-command is put in jail, Frank makes his move. He heads to Thailand to make an offer he thinks Ike can't refuse. Bangkok, Thailand. Frank is at Ike's center of operations, Jack's American Star Bar. Ike listens to Frank's pitch to become his business partner.
Ike was always wary of Frank. He didn't fully trust him. And he told him, yes, we can work out something.
But Ike doesn't want to give Frank any control within his organization. He wants him as his dealer in Harlem.
Ike says, I'm going to be the boss. I'm going to be controlling the distribution, and I'll give you the drugs. but it's not exclusively you. You know, I'll be dealing with other people.
It's a rejection Frank will never forget. And he knows he's lost out on multi-millions of dollars. Now, in the interrogation room, Ike will pay for turning his back on Frank. Frank is about to tell the cops the astonishing story behind Blue Magic and the ex-master sergeant in the US Army behind the operation, Ike Atkinson. (1968), Vietnam. The war is still raging. Retired Army Sergeant Ike Atkinson spots an opportunity with a former military colleague, Herman Jackson, to supply the US with high-grade heroin. Ike and Jackson buy cheap heroin from the poppy fields of the Golden Triangle in Laos, Burma, and Thailand. Ike smuggles the heroin into US bases in North Carolina on board military aircraft.
Atkinson tried smuggling some heroin himself aboard military aircraft back to the States, was successful in doing that.
It's so successful, he expands his operation using a network of active GIs to transport the heroin.
Slowly but surely, he built this network using soldiers that were going back to the United States on leave. And the US military were not paying attention. They were in a war.
After 4 years, the authorities start to suspect heroin is entering through US military bases. But how?
Authorities were aware of narcotics coming into the country. They knew somehow the military or military people were involved in this, but nobody knew who Ike Atkinson was for several years, just the way Ike Atkinson liked it.
With extra scrutiny at military customs, Ike's operation had to get creative.
There are these small overnight bags. The GIs called them AWOL bags. Absent without leave, you know, it's just a small gym bag type thing made out of leather. They would sew in a false bottom. Under that false bottom, there'd be about 700 grams of pure heroin.
Ike develops even more ingenious smuggling methods. Film canisters, soldiers wearing leg casts, while building a network of at least 50 associates and hundreds of GIs in the process.
And just say, hey, can you take this back with you? Somebody to pick it up from you. Others, they paid. Others, they relieved debt from their gambling.
Ike continues to keep one step ahead of the authorities.
Came up with an ingenious way of shipping heroin using teak furniture.
As much as 100 kilos of heroin at a time was squeezed into hollowed-out furniture bound for the US.
He was looking for an opportunity to make a few huge shipments that would set him up for the rest of his life.
Buying a kilo of heroin for $4,000 and selling it for $100,000 nets a profit of $96,000 per kilo. Ike begins to amass a vast fortune.
They'd take the 1 pure kilogram of heroin and make 4 kilograms of 25% pure heroin and sell each one for $25,000.
And Ike has a vast network of dealers, each demanding more and more of his purer product.
He had customers throughout the East Coast of the United States, not only New York City, but Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Washington, D.C. He had customers out on the West Coast.
The DEA says that between 1968 and 1975, he made $400 million, which today's money would probably be closer to $1.2 billion.
The DEA administrator at a news conference said that it was probably the largest smuggling organization of Asian heroin in history. Atkinson, in the drug world, was the kingpin. He had the dope, and he who has the dope rules.
Trying to evade the DEA, Ike continues to use military aircraft to smuggle pure heroin through military bases for years. Frank Lucas is about to bring the whole enterprise crashing down. June 1975. Frank Lucas's information is explosive. What remains of Ike Atkinson's network is also arrested.
As far as I know, as far as I was told by the feds in New York, he gave up everybody.
He was informing on his criminal associates. I mean, people he did business with, people in his organization, people in other organizations. As a result of Frank's cooperation, I believe well over 100 people were convicted of narcotic distribution.
Lucas gave significant information. I'm not saying he gave everything he knew, but he gave, I'm going to say, maybe 60% of what he knew.
Already charged with heroin trafficking, the cops now realize the extent of Ike's organization. It is estimated that his smuggling network into the US is worth $50 million a year. And yet outside the DEA, few people even knew he existed.
The key ingredient to Ike Atkinson's success was that no one knew who he was, and the reason why they didn't know is the system. These former and current military men had access to airplanes. They weren't questioned. They could bring it right over, no questions asked.
Ike pleads guilty and is sentenced to 19 years in jail. The dogged work of Richie Roberts, his Z-Team in New Jersey, and members of the DEA in New York have finally seen Frank, Ike, and their networks brought down. Frank's cooperation sees his 70-year jail sentence reduced to just 6. Frank is freed in 1981. The #1 heroin dealer in Harlem, the boss of a brutal criminal gang that controlled the streets through murder and violence, who delivers the real heroin kingpin, is a free man.
But it paid off for him because he was able to get out of jail early.
Frank Lucas was probably one of the major heroin traffickers in the New York City area. There's no question about that. But as far as taking the heroin trade from the Golden Triangle to the addicts in the street in New York City, and it's just not the case.
Frank's life may have inspired American Gangster, but Frank's real story is very different to the movie. And Frank's criminal history doesn't end there. Within only 3 years, Frank is back in jail again for dealing heroin. This time he is sentenced to 7 years, serves the full term, and is released in 1991. As for the man behind Blue Magic, after the initial sentence of 19 years in jail, Ike is given a further 13 for continuing his smuggling operation from inside prison. Ike is eventually freed in 2007, having served a total of 32 years. And when the film is released in the same year, Richie Roberts receives a surprising call from him.
He said that Frank, he was proud. I did most of that. Frank didn't do it. I controlled Asia, and I didn't get my credit. They think it's credit.
Then Ike threatens revenge on Frank.
What are you saying? He says, I'm going to go up there and I'm going to kill him. So I said to Ike, Ike, how old are you? He said, I'm 80. I said, Ike, you ain't killing anybody. Get a rocking chair. He's down in North Carolina. Sit on the porch, go by a river, watch the water go by. And he started laughing.
Ike died in 2014 at the age of 88. Frank Lucas, also 88, is still alive. With his mafia connections through Bumpy Johnson, Frank Lucas undoubtedly rose to become a large-scale heroin dealer in 1970s Harlem. But he got his heroin from Ike Atkinson. Ike was the real American gangster, who created a smuggling operation unlike any seen before. For a decade, Ike's audacious network of military servicemen, planes, and bases that brought vast quantities of heroin from Southeast Asia into the US was unstoppable. Until Frank brought him down. Frank Lucas was nothing more than his man in New York.